Well, welcome everybody. My name is Stephen Butler. I'm a volunteer with Tse Chen Ling Center for Tibetan Buddhist Studies here in San Francisco. And we're very, very pleased to have this wonderful program with two amazing women as part of Tse Chen Ling's year-long series, Women of Wisdom, celebrating the living legacy of Buddhist women. So we're just a couple of months into this series. We've had some remarkable programs highlighting Buddhist practitioners, scholars, issues related to women, and highlighting the teachers in the lineage who are female, highlighting the women practitioners, highlighting scholarship done by amazing women scholars. And the idea is to contribute to an increased awareness and focus on programming that features Buddhist women. So this is the second time Tse Chen Ling has done a Women of Wisdom series, the first being in 2002. So we're very, very happy to be able to continue this. So I'll be serving as today's moderator. So we're going to go ahead and just jump right in and introduce the topic and introduce our wonderful, wonderful presenters. So with us today, as we look at Lama Yeshe's empowerment of women, is the topic. We have two people who have very deep and powerful connections with Lama Yeshe. The first, Judith Weitzner, has met Lama Yeshe in 1969. And as she recounted, he made a comment to her, it makes my heart break to see how older people are treated in America. If you can do something about it, that would be good. And Judy certainly has done that. For 40 years, she's worked in the field of aging. She helped found the first hospice in Contra Costa County. And she also produced and hosted a television show for 10 years about issues of concern to older adults. She's an activist and a person who has deep experience with the FPMT and the vision of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche. We also have Vicki Mackenzie, a professional journalist and author who has written for national and international press for over 40 years. Her articles have appeared in the Sunday Times, The Observer, the Daily and Sunday Telegraph, the Daily Mail, and many national magazines. Her published books include Reincarnation, The Boy Lama, Cave in the Snow, Why Buddhism, and The Revolutionary Life of Frida Betty, British feminist, Indian nationalist, and Buddhist nun. So we're very, very happy to have both of you here today. So Judy and Vicki, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
As we look at this topic, we know that there's a lot of ground to cover. So we will be kind of navigating through this wonderful world of both Lama Yeshe, but also his impact on women, highlighting the significant a membership in the early community around Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche that were mostly women, and those unique ways in which Lama Yeshe's unique, again, I'll use the word unique, it's hard to find another word with Lama Yeshe, let's call it revolutionary, way of bringing Buddhism to the Western world, how that intersected with these two remarkable women. So to get us started, I'm going to ask both Judy and Vicki. Let's start with Judy. Can you share with us the encounter or instance that Lama Yeshe that resulted in you first being hooked by his teachings or by just simply being around Lama Yeshe? So we'll start with Vicki or excuse me, start with Judy and then come to Vicki for the same question. Thank you.
Well, it took a long time to hook me. I met Lama Yeshe in Nepal in 1969, early 1969. I had taken a teaching job at Lincoln School, the international school. The fourth grade teacher at the school was Max Matthews. Max was an African American woman who had traveled around the world teaching and had opened the very first art gallery in Kathmandu. And that gallery was a salon of sorts, and people circulated through there. And one person who turned up at the gallery, an old friend of hers, who she had known in Greece, was Zina Rochevsky. Now, Zina was the first Western student of Lama Yeshe. And I would say she was a formidable and rather difficult person. She was used to having her own way. Indeed, she actually was a princess, a Russian princess. So the very first students that Lama Yeshe had, Max Matthews, myself, Jacqueline, who was with Zena, so he had women students. And at one point, I mentioned to him that some of them were not the easiest people to work with. He said, I'm experimenting, dear, experimenting to see how this works. So I had, because my initial time with him was a friendship, we had so much fun going on picnics. We took him to the dining room at the American Embassy. We trekked together in the Himalayas. And if any of you are interested in these stories, I've written a number of them up. You can read them later. But I had, you know, the Buddha said, the Dalai Lama, you know, test a relationship like you would gold with a teacher. And so I had 5 years of friendship to brainstorm with him and think of projects and do things together before I actually took teachings from him in 1975 and had the Chenrezig initiation and then took refuge. And after that, he said, I knew someday I could hook you, dear. So, Vicki, what about you?
Well, yes, I was working on a national newspaper, very hectic daily newspaper in London in Fleet Street. And this lady who I knew, who was the beauty and health editor of Harper's magazine, Harper's Queen magazine, she called to speak to the editor, and I picked up the phone because the editor wasn't there. It was pandemonium, usual meeting a deadline sort of thing. And I said, Leslie, her name was Leslie Kenton, very, very influential writer on health, American, actually the daughter of Stan Kenton, just to drop a name in. But that, not that not that she ever went on that. But I said, he's not here, Leslie. I said, but what are you up to? And she said, oh, I'm just about to go to Nepal to meditate, to see the lamas and to see, if they have any influence on people's health, what they're teaching has any influence on people's health. And I said, oh, Leslie, how fantastic. So she said, come with me. And I said, yes, I will. Just like that. It was just a complete whim. I knew nothing about Buddhism, but I'd been looking for something for many, many years. And so off I went to Nepal with her, to Kopan in 76. And, very all hippies, apart from, well, mostly all hippies, apart from Leslie and myself. And I was riveted by Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Because you see, as a journalist, you meet many, 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 many people of different walks of life. So you're not fazed by people. You've interviewed so many famous people and all the rest of it. So it doesn't really have much impression on you. But I'd never met anybody quite like Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, refugees, horrendous backgrounds, terrible escape. And yet there they were, unbelievably relaxed. And Lama Yeshe in particular, his English was very odd, as everybody knows, but he was an ace communicator. And that really struck me. I thought this man is trying to get something across to us, not just with his words, which were very interesting, very odd English he'd picked up down the way, but by his whole body, by his gestures, by his whole, he kind of gave out. And so I thought this was the most amazing one of the most amazing human beings I'd met. And also both he and Rinpoche didn't seem traumatized by their they were refugees, we didn't have running water where we were. I mean, it was very, very basic, no toilets, nothing. I mean, it was very poor. And they were giving this course away for basically nothing. And yet they could have raked in a lot of money. But that wasn't the point. What they were trying to give us was something so, to them, so precious. And so I was very, very amazed that these beings were so untraumatized as refugees. But what I really liked, apart from Lama Yeshe's unbelievable efforts to communicate, was that he kept saying over and over again, "You check up." That was his catchphrase. You check up on what he was talking about. And being a journalist, you're never an easy believer. And as a journalist, you're meant to quiz people and get with if what they're saying is genuine. You're meant to question the whole time. That's the job. And I really loved it that this was the message. You check up, dear. You check up. And I thought this is very, very intelligent. And so a lot of what I was being told made absolute sense because I'd already been kind of very interested in spiritual matters, and lots of really, I knew about, impermanence and goodness. I knew a lot of stuff seemingly already. A lot of stuff I didn't accept at all. I just didn't agree with it. It took me many, many years to accept karma, for example. That I thought was kind of a ludicrous kind of notion that they were talking about. But so it was really the presence. And also I have to say, it was the laughter, because I'd never met spiritual holy beings, who laughed as much. And I think that was such a hook for me. But however, I wasn't hooked completely. I just thought, this is very interesting. I'm going to go back to my job and I'm going to check up. So like Judy, it took me a long time to really, I mean, I took refuge that first course because it was because I liked them so much, and I found what they were saying was so sincere, and also I liked that they were talking from their hearts and from their own experience and not just from book learning. I found that deeply impressive, deeply, deeply impressive. And so, and I liked the fact that they encouraged questioning. So it gave me a lot of material, and of course began to write articles about what they were saying and so forth.
Like you, Vicki, I was really skeptical, and at one point, Lama said to me, I see when I'm talking to you, you're thinking and you're trying to, we're working on all of this." And I thought, oh my God, I'm busted. He said, "Good, dear, it's really good to check up." And he really liked that quality, and it really was something that made it much easier for me to accept that I could test the teachings.
Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to say was, from the early on, we were kind of cultural interpreters for each other. I was teaching him English. We would go through Vogue magazine in Max's apartment and look at pictures, and he would ask me what was going on. And then when he came to the West, he was like to watch television and wanted sort of commentary on what was going on. And I started to really delve into what was going on with the Tibetan refugees and his own life history, and started to take his oral history from him at times when I met him. And a lot of that was embedded in Big Love, the book, if you want to read that. Lots of the history I got from him. But one of the things I learned early on was that he was the incarnation of the abbess of a monastery, a woman. And he had been raised by the nuns, Often he would go visit and they would take care of him when he was a little boy. So he was used to being in the company of women. And
Mm,
at one point, was kind of lolling around with him and having such a good time. And I realized, this is just an unusual relationship, how easy and humorous and fun it is. And I said, how is it, Lama, that you are so easy with women? You seem to understand me so well. And he said, oh, he said, I was a woman in my previous life. It's so easy to understand. I
mm,
remember, you know.
mm. And that was a wonderful thing. He really was absolutely balanced male, female
Yeah. One
in
time
his,
he stood in front of me and said, what am I, dear? Tell me, am I a man or a woman?
yeah.
And that was it. What there was exactly, you put it perfectly.
It's very, very attractive in a person because, as we all could see from all the pictures, to see him with children and babies, I mean, he kind of just gathered them all up, and very, very feminine and that kind of nurturing and wanting to cook for everybody and things like that. But on the other hand, he was definitely very strong male as well. It wasn't as though one eclipsed the other. I remember him saying, I think it was the time of some another amazing crisis in the Middle East, and Lama Yeshe shocked us all by saying, I mean, he was so strong. He said, if I was in charge, I would get all the big aeroplanes and I would fly over this Middle Eastern country. I can't remember which one it was. I would fly over them so low and shatter all the glass in their windows. And it was wow, this is no pussycat here, He was so there was this wonderful balance, as you were saying, of male and female. It was very balanced person, really. Mm.
Fascinating, staying with that balance, Judy, you talked about that early community was essentially women. And then over time, how did the community flourish? And what did that ratio of women to men, how did that kind of manifest over time? And do you think this kind of ability of Lama Yeshe to balance both the masculine and feminine was a determining factor for the growth of the community or the makeup of the community, especially in the early days? And I'll ask you both to kind of reflect on that.
Yeah. Why don't you start, Vicki?
I mean, there were men. There were men. I mean, it's very interesting that Zena and Mummy Max were very strong in the beginning of the whole thing, but there were guys there too, like Nick Rebush, who was Dr. Nick, and Adrian, and it wasn't female top heavy
No.
in my experience anyway. It was there were lots of very dedicated guys who stuck around forever and still there. Peter Kedge and Harvey Horrocks, and they were all very strong and helped with the building of places and continued really.
Well, one thing about that balance, that one of the things that impressed me early on about Tibetan Buddhism was how psychologically advanced it was, really. I had studied psychology, and I was so impressed with um, balancing the male and female, and eventually having a Tara initiation, and Lama Yeshe, embodied Tara himself and mentioned that it was good for him to give this initiation to men, for them to get in touch with their female side also. And so it was kind of Jungian, anima, animas. Um, so he was bringing out, and, also gave wrathful, like Vajrapani initiation to us in California, maybe other places too, but that kind of wrathful wisdom. And
Mm.
at one point he told me, you need to show your wrath more. You think you're not supposed to manifest anger, but at times it's very useful and important to really draw the line. And he encouraged that in me and probably other people and women, you know, that were maybe less likely to show their anger.
Mm. I think he said that. I was trying to find it in Big Love, where he said he was giving a generalization of what women needed, of what they lacked, and it was that kind of power aspect that, you know, we're frightened to show or demonstrate, you know, kind of power, because it's always been seen to be masculine or not correct for us at all.
Yeah. He had
Remember,
an adopted daughter also in the Tibetan Children's Village. And he invited her to come to meals and stuff when he was in at Tushita in Dharamsala. And one time I was staying there with him, and the daughter came, oh, maybe she was 10 or 11 years old. And
oh yeah,
he said, Judy, I want her to go to California and join women's liberation. I want her to feel powerful and be able to do anything. And, you know, I mean, so he understood about women's liberation, but he said it's not just women's liberation, total liberation is what I want for you, you know, so.
that's very beautiful. I mean, his whole message, which ran through all his teachings, was this. I mean, was to kind of encourage us, male and female. You know, he saw that our greatest problem was that we didn't have enough self-confidence,
Mhm. And
and
he said frequently, maybe to you too, I have total confidence in you. When he would give me a big work assignment of some kind, and I would kind of like, how am I going to do that? You can do it. You know, I have total confidence. So that being backed up with by someone with total confidence and, you know, unconditional love is a pretty powerful thing.
it is. Yes, and I can remember he would say things like, you know, you are, because it was the time of the Cold War when I met him, and for a few years afterwards, he'd say, "You people, you are frightened of nuclear bomb, but I tell you, your mind, your energy is greater than nuclear bomb." He was always telling us that the that the ability that we had. I wrote down some of his quotes, like if I can find it here. He would say things like, "The mind is so strong. Never underestimate the power of the mind. You completely underestimate your ability." He was always saying that. He was always saying that, you know, as a he found that in Westerners he was really talking to there. And yes, and I remember him. What's actually, I had this acquaintance, and she was actually a very attractive woman, but she was, but she did lack self confidence. And I remember Lama getting hold of his mala and kind of slapping her on the shoulders and saying, "You are beautiful. You are beautiful. You are beautiful," trying to get it through to her. You know that he was so. But he tried to do it with everybody. It wasn't just women. He felt that as, you know, as people, we had too much cringe about ourselves, really. Mm.
Definitely something in our society that's really manifest that comes out, I think, in our interaction with the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. That's something that a lot of Tibetan teachers dial into is our propensity for self-loathing and lack of confidence. You know, Judy, you mentioned kind of that kind of pith instruction from Lama Yeshe saying, you know, you can do it, you can do anything, I can have this confidence. How did he particularly inspire you to use your existing organizing skills to help support the vision of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche in sharing the message of the Buddha Dharma?
Well, one thing I was very skeptical of gurus, and as they manifested in the West early on was sort of giving over your power to the guru, and the guru would direct your life. I think that's part of my 5 years of waiting to take refuge. And I was afraid that that I would have some direction from a teacher to not do what I was doing, which was frontline social work, working with really suffering and difficult situations. And I felt that it was so important to do that. And one of the things he affirmed it was that it was okay for me to continue the work I did. And what I tried to do was just bring Buddhism into everything I did, to integrate it with my work as a
Mm.
social worker and as a teacher. So, he didn't he would appreciate, if I could, and could only take vacations, then I would go to meditation courses for 2 weeks, but that's all I had. But it was fine with him, and in fact encouraged to just integrate Buddhism into our daily life and live it in that way. And that was really my practice. Sometimes I would say mantras on the way to work and on the way home. But, and I started a lifelong learning for older adults in the community college, and I based all of my classes that I gave on Lam Rim, but never a word was spoken. So about, with Buddhist terminology or anything. And I started to call it stealth Buddhism. I tried to practice Buddhism, but without all of the, paraphernalia that's off-putting to some people. And interestingly, there's a woman named Laura Greenwood who came up with the same terminology, and did actually, we had such parallel lives. She also just took Buddhism and put it into her work with Lama's encouragement.
Fantastic. Fascinating. Vicki, I have a question for you in your book on Frida Betty, this remarkable biography that you've written. We'll share information about both Big Love, the book Big Love, and the book, the biography of Frida Betty that you wrote at the end of the program. But in that book, you tell a remarkable story of Lama Yeshe prostrating when Frida, by that point in her life, she was an ordained nun, took the throne to teach. Can you elaborate on that episode, its impact at the time, and the impact you see now?
Well, actually, I don't think, I think I was told two different stories. I just missed her. It was in 76 and she'd just been there, but I was there, for the November course. Um, she was there, and Lama Yeshe, she came up to Copan. I don't, and Lama Yeshe wasn't on the throne, but he put her on the little throne. There's the big throne, and then there's little ones beside. And then he did the prostrations to her, and it was quite astonishing, apparently. Um, but I mean, because she was such a she was such a bodhisattva, and she was such a powerhouse, Frida Bedi, and I mean, yeah, we can. So I mean, he honored her. He actually demonstrated. I mean, it was quite extraordinary, really, because sometime before then, after then, I mean, oh yeah, I have to tell you one thing is that Lama Yeshe was actually responsible for the Cave in the Snow book, because, so you're saying how it had come into my life, because I just finished writing Reincarnation, the Boy Lama in Copan. I went to write it in Copan, on an electric, no, even a manual typewriter. That was interesting. Um, Back in the day. And I I was in a little house in Copan looking out over, and I just put the finishing full stop. And I sat back in my chair and I was looking out over the stupa there. And this voice hit me. I mean, little Lama Rosel was there as well. He kept popping in and out and being very kind of shy and embarrassed, as though he knew what I was doing. But the book was really, Reincarnation was really about Lama Yeshe. Anyway, I was sitting there and looking out, feeling it's a bit like I haven't had children, but I think it must be just like writing a book is like giving birth. You know, it's such a long process, day after day, month after month. And it just goes on. I was so relieved. And I just sat there looking up. And suddenly this thought hit me at the back of my head. This voice said, "What about the women, dear?" And I thought I knew it was Lama. What about the women, dear? And I thought, yeah, you know, this whole kind of book was a pay on to the male, beautiful male bodhisattvas, you know. And I thought, yeah, well, I was never a feminist like that. I thought, well, yes, what about the women? Why aren't there any? Why don't we see any women, you know, on the thrones and doing anything? But that was Lama. So I set about I thought, the last thing you want to do when you've just finished a book is actually start another one because you're just exhausted, you know, it's just such a long, arduous task. And so I thought, oh yes, I'll write a book about the amazing spiritual women I can find of all denominations, not necessarily Buddhist. And then I was doing that. Then I went into researching and doing a lot of very interesting women. And then I came across Tenzin Palmo in Instituto Lama Tsongkhapa and I thought, and she'd just come out of her cave, and I thought, oh, she'd make a good chapter. And so I asked her if she wouldn't mind being interviewed. But her story was so strong and so kind of compelling that it just eclipsed every other story that I was gathering. So I said, would you mind if if I put it in, you know, made a book out of it? So that was Lama Yeshe. There's no doubt about it. Lama Yeshe pushing me. Yeah.
Talk about it echoing through one's life. That's a very visceral echo of somebody leaving an impression. You know, I'm curious, and I'd love to hear from both of you on this. But I would imagine that during the early days of the community, many were showing up in Nepal empowered by the radical changes around gender equity that had been taking place in Western countries from the 50s through the 70s. And maybe it's wrong for me, but I would assume that many may have been off-put or challenged by some of the elements of Indo-Tibetan Buddhist culture that stemmed from its origins in a very different patriarchal structure. I'm curious, how did the early community react to this? Was there a voice of opposition or concern? And how did this experience change over time? Maybe we'll start with Judy, and then I'd love to hear from Vicki on the same topic.
You know, that wasn't my issue. Um, there were, I heard people, and, you know, it was so early in feminism when I first went. And then people got more vociferous and concerned about hierarchy. But at least knowing Lama and how, you know, as we've said, it wasn't an issue with Lama. And he was actively doing things for women. And, you know, we had the Copan school set up for the boys, but he was from the beginning wanting to start something for girls too. You know, so I didn't experience personally a problem with, but I heard voices. But what was your experience, Vicki?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't really, that was quite later on.
Yeah.
I think when Judy and I were beginning there, the women's lib movement, and it was just beginning really. And as we say, we didn't have it from Lama Yeshe. I remember though I remember tackling Lama Zopa after Lama had passed away and saying to him, yeah, I said to him, now, well, why aren't there more women on the thrones? Why aren't there? And he looked at me and he said, nothing's stopping you. So that was such a challenge. And then he thought for a moment and he said, it's the culture. The Buddhas only appear in the form which is useful when they can be heard and seen. He said before, if women had appeared there were, amazing practitioners, female practitioners in Tibet, but they were up in the caves, not being public and being seen. Um, he said, but he said it's the culture, because if they'd appeared, nobody would have listened to them. But you have to, it's all to do with causes and conditions. When the conditions change, he said, then the Buddha, then they can appear in female form. So it's only very recently that it's become kind of quite, women have become more assertive and questioning of the patriarchal system. So I don't think we can really help you very much there, Stephen.
Yeah.
I don't.
No, and Lama was always trying to distinguish between cultural artifacts and, pure Buddhism and what was cultural. But for us, being around Sherpa and Tibetan families where there was polyandry and women had, to me, a very egalitarian role compared to American women. They were running the business and uh, so I felt they were an example. At least the society was an example for us. Maybe not who was sitting on the throne at the time.
I think it was more an issue for the girls and the women in the Tibetan in the Himalayan areas, which is why Tenzin Palmo began to really open up start her nunnery to help the women of the Himalayan areas who
Mhm.
were not given the scholastic and the philosophical training needed to gain full awakening.
And look what's happened during our lifetime, the Nuns Project. There's so many nunneries and women becoming geishas and teachers.
Yes,
We've watched that all evolve.
yes. There's a way to go yet, but Tibetan nuns particularly, they haven't got full ordination. They stay at the level of novices. Tenzin Palmo is very much onto that, and so are lots of other beings. That's the mm,
I wanted to reflect on something Vicki said about Lama telling her what about the women in her head. But after he made that comment that Stephen spoke about, if you can do something to help old people in America, it makes my heart break to see how they're treated. I went back to the United States and was working again as a social worker, and a job came up in the Office on Aging, newly formed. There was no such thing before as the Office on Aging. And I looked at it and I thought, oh God, I don't know anything about this, but heard his words in my mind and went and applied for it. And when I was walking into the oral interview that I needed to pass to be able to get the job, I was kind of thinking, Lama, if you want me to get this job, you better take care of this interview because I am pretty ignorant about this. And he did. I mean, I was hired and first on the list and spent the rest of my career in aging. So Lama comes through when you need him.
yeah, yeah.
Fascinating. Fascinating. You, Vicky, did you want to say anything?
No, 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 no. I was just thinking, yes, he's come through for me too. Yeah, when I've needed him. Yeah, it's really amazing. Yeah.
You know, one thing that that's come out, and Judy, you talked about, and I think both of you have been involved in this, is this really kind of cultural and conceptual translation project that you've been part of, knowing that that was so much of what formed Lama Yeshe's teaching style, his manner of delivering the Buddha Dharma was really on the spot, kind of translating it conceptually and culturally with this unique kind of group of people, and both of you were kind of on the front lines and played a significant part in that. Could you talk a little bit more about what it was like to be part of that energy on the spot, of seeing it literally happening in real time? Whereas I think now, certainly my generation's the beneficiary of that work. But I'd love to hear kind of some reports from the front lines of how that all came together, since both of you were involved with that. So,
Tell a little story. He came to Berkeley, and he was going to give a public talk. And I said, we have to have a title for the talk. And he had, in Tibet, a Lama comes and everybody comes. You don't need a title for the talk. This was a whole new idea for him. I said, well, we need a title because we need to put up flyers. This is how we advertise things in those days. And he said, well, what are people interested in? And I said, sex, drugs, and nuclear war. It was just a throwaway line. He says, okay, that's it. That'll be the title of the talk. And I said, I'm backing away quickly. No, we can't really call it that. But his thing was, he said, how will I know what I'm going to talk about until I see the people in the room? I have to, and person after person has recounted coming to his lecture or talk and feeling that he was speaking directly to them and to the question they came in with. And it was, to me, kind of a miracle that so many people simultaneously could feel that way, that he was talking specifically to them and to their problem. He got it. And what I mentioned, he loved watching television, but his purpose in watching TV was to kind of get the culture that he was in and to see what it was that advertising people could manipulate the mind and how they did that. But he would adapt even from culture to culture. Like in California, it was his he would talk about chocolate. What you really want is chocolate. And but I think in Italy, he had pizza or something else. He understood the various individual cultures as he traveled around the world.
He was really very, very, very unusual in that he could think outside the box.
Yeah.
And when you think of the not many Tibetan lamas could do that. Very few. And he understood the Western mind, and he was interested in understanding the Western mind. And Lama Zopa, I think, mentioned or said that either it was very hard for a woman to get enlightenment because he always followed the text. He was far more fundamental. And so the people in the yeah, so the people in the Gompa in the early days were enraged about this remark that women couldn't get enlightened. So they stormed off to Lama Yeshe. And he said, of course they can. Same mind, same capacity. So, he wasn't even, he was very, very encouraging about that. Yeah. And one thing that how I managed to translate what he was saying into journalism, because I thought, well, look, these people are saying extraordinary things, and I think that the general public would be very interested in what these Tibetan lamas have to offer. And so when I went back from that first Copan course, I thought I would start writing articles for the newspapers, which is very mainstream. You can't get more mainstream than newspapers. And so I thought, well, okay. So I was told that one of the kind of contentious things that they said, I was told in that first quiz, that birth was suffering. One of the first noble truths, that birth was suffering. And this kind of shook the foundations of Western sentimentalism, that birth was a miracle and wonderful and dreamy and romantic, but not according to the teachings of the Buddha. It's a horrendous experience. But it was at the same time that all this is in Europe. I don't know whether this happened in America, But it was at the same time when birth without violence and all those new age birth movements were just beginning, where babies were born in dark conditions and not with lights and not being slapped on the back, and women didn't have their feet in stirrups, they could go into water. There was a whole new huge, so I thought I'm going to test out whether or not babies born in this new movement that was happening in Europe and in Britain particularly, whether the babies are any different and what the experience of the mothers were with the babies. So that was the first article I wrote when I went back from Copan. By then I was a freelance because I couldn't go back to the paper I was in because I should have left to go to Copan. And I wrote this article and it was huge, and it was accepted by the Sunday Times, and they gave it a half-page spread, which was very big. So then the babies were different. They were very calm, and a lot of them were, what do you call it, when they're equally balanced, right and left hands, hemispheres of their brain were more, right hand and left hand were balanced. And so it was a very interesting, so I did a lot of checking up, as Lama said, did a lot of checking up. I did a lot of checking up on the home birth death movements too, which I think you went to in Chen Raising and other places, death, the hospice, home births, home deaths, which was just beginning too. So I did a lot of the material which I'd been given by Lama Yeshe and so forth. And I checked up and did a lot of stories on it. So they really did inform my work a lot. And I did a lot of work on mind-body links in medicine too. Yeah.
I had been a practitioner, as I say, of stealth Buddhism and tried very hard because I thought that it would actually not be of benefit to me professionally to be identified as kind of a kook or something. People's attitude, they didn't really know what it was, but they might have negative feelings about it. And years passed, and I began sitting on a committee to start the first hospice in our county.
Right.
And it was the first time there was a go around. There was mainly medical professionals there, and I was there as a social worker in aging. And it came time to make an introduction of myself, and I don't know why it came forward at that moment, but I said that I was a Buddhist and that I was very interested in compassion and care throughout the lifespan and through the death process. And that's why I was there. And rather than people, holding back, or it suddenly made such a big impression on all these people, and they came forward and wanted to know more, and
Yeah.
really paid me a lot of respect, actually,
Yeah.
because of that comment. But that was the first time I kind of was out of the, the closet.
Well, I was horrified when Bloomsbury, which published Harry Potter, on my book on Lama Yeshe and Lama Rosel, which they asked me to write, incidentally. I knew an editor, they asked me to write about Osel. And I called it The Boy Lama, and they stuck reincarnation across the whole top of it. I didn't want that. I was so scared because you couldn't talk about reincarnation. It was regarded as something really mad, kind of, it was completely, I was very, very nervous about that. But funnily enough, I thought I'd be, absolutely laughed out of town and be discredited. But it didn't work out like that, that was Lama again, it was, the BBC took it up and interviewed me and all sorts of real mainstream stuff. So that was all Lama, bringing these ideas into the West, really. It's very scary. Yeah.
Remarkable, though. Again, talk about the front lines of this happening real time for all of us, where so much of this is been established. There's an infrastructure there, and you were part of seeing that infrastructure being laid out. I'm curious. And I don't want to put you both on the spot, but conversations within Buddhism and beyond, obviously, it has been referenced by both of you, have seen significant discussions and calls for kind of accelerated movement towards gender equity. Without putting you directly on the spot, how do you feel Lama Yeshe's example and guidance from what you've both experienced and what he shared with each of you, how do you feel that can provide support as we all move forward with these issues? We'll start with you, Judy.
I'm not quite understanding.
I'm thinking that, and I think Vicki, you referenced, there's still work to be done, but clearly there's this example that Lama Yeshe kind of shared with each of you and empowered you to kind of uphold and live authentically with and work through. In many ways, what guidance do you think could be provided to those as we move through that additional work that needs to be done?
What are you talking about, Steve? I don't quite understand your question.
Yeah, so with where it's still at a point where movement has taken place about accelerated movement towards gender equity within Buddhism and within Buddhist communities and beyond. But how do you feel Lama Yeshe's example and guidance can provide support as we move forward with that work that needs to be done? Um,
Well, it's hard for me to say.
mm,
It's what we've been talking about. I think that if people read his writings, watch videos of him, they'll feel empowered, regardless. That the way teaching's done in the various centers, like Tse Chen Ling, Vajrapani. We watched actually at Vajrapani, which was founded down in the Santa Cruz Mountains, as many of you know, the first center in California, or it was male dominated at first because these people were coming that were great workmen and craftsmen coming, the men, and the task at hand was to build out of cut down trees and build. And so mostly the men ran things for a while. But the women finally, there was one woman that came that really brought the feminist issue to the forward there and equalized things at Vajrapani. And then finally we had a female director, Petra, who could, was such a powerful woman. But so I watched the transition within institutions, even that were established here, from, and it was Lama, it was how Lama taught all of us that we were prone to and followed that path. And I think that now this next generation that's been raised without the problems that we experienced with gender inequity, they're further along. It's going to continue. It was started and the ball got moved forward.
Thank you, Judy. Anything, Vicki, you want to share along those lines?
Well, I think it requires, I think what was started and what happened within those early days is boldness. Lama was bold, and those early women were bold, and Tenzin Palmo was bold, and Frida Bailey was unbelievably bold. She went to jail, she fought for Gandhi, got imprisoned and all of that. For equality. She was bold. She was one of the first women, Frida Bailey, to go and become fully ordained as a nun the full ordination. I have to say, spurred on by the Karmapa who organized it, he was the one. He said, "You are Western, and so you have the confidence." She was an Oxford scholar as well, so she had the confidence to do it, which was a shining example for the Tibetans or the Tibetan nuns to do likewise when they see somebody. So I think we still have to be very bold. And yeah, and I think Lama would really approve of that. He was bold, and he was a revolutionary. His
But
Holiness.
he was criticized by Tibetans. They thought he was off the rail. And, toward the end of his life, many of them had come around and seen, how important the work he was. I had the experience of having an audience with Lama Yeshe with the Dalai Lama. He asked me to come and talk about the work I was doing. And I witnessed that everything was reported by Lama Yeshe to the Dalai Lama about his work and approved by the Dalai Lama. So he had that backing of the Dalai Lama to do this very bold work that you're talking about and actually ruffle the feathers of a lot of Tibetans.
Yeah. And Lama was not afraid to go against his own system.
Yeah.
I remember him saying, "I don't bother with the lineage lamas. That's not for you. That's not for you people. We just go straight to the essence." So, I mean, it was bold. I mean, it's brave of him, since it was so, the tradition is so strong to break. I mean, he didn't break the tradition. You know what I mean? The essence of the tradition. Didn't mean that, but he was bold, and yeah. So I don't know that that answers your question,
So,
Stephen. I think that we can all, yeah, I think we can all still remember and take a lesson from Lama. I mean, he wasn't afraid to wear colors that really weren't traditional. He had these favorite kind of cerise and kind of pink kind of top halves. If I don't know what they're called in the uniform, but he was never afraid. He was never afraid to be himself. And I think that's something which Tenzin Palmo says, is that, becoming 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 more awakened. It's not that you go into a kind of a amorphous blob. You become more and more vivid as an individual. All the great beings that I've met within Tibetan Buddhism, they're not little sheep. They're kind of vivid characters.
Uh, one humorous thing that happened with Lama was going to the beach with a bunch of the Vajrapani people, and Lama turns up in a yellow swim trunks, not your traditional attire.
Yeah.
And he wants to go in the water. And we were all worried about him going in the water. And I said, "But Lama, you can't swim." And he said, "Well, maybe I can." I said, "Well, how, how would you know how to swim?" He said, "Maybe you've learned in previous life." He said, so he goes into the water with an air mattress. He's kind of holding it. There's pictures of all this. And the Vajrapani boys are all out in this circle around him, trying to protect him from being bowled over. But, he was going to go in the water. I mean, and driving. I
Oh,
mean, oh my God, he was determined to learn to drive. And you can imagine how that was for a Himalayan person. And I was determined to keep him from driving, but I didn't succeed. And one time in Berkeley, we were going to go. I loved astronomy, and I was going to take him to to see Saturn through a telescope. And we got in the car ready to go along this very windy mountain road to where the observatory was. And Lama took the wheel. I said, God, Lama, no, you can't drive. I'm going to drive. This is very dangerous. He said, no, I'm going to drive. He said, you visualize yourself as Tara. You'll be okay. And there was a guy in the back seat, just white knuckled, just terrified at what was going on in the car. And I turned back and I said, Robbie, just ironically, I said, don't worry, Robbie, we're visualizing ourselves as Tara. And I said, at least I am. Who are you visualizing yourself as, Lama? And he says, Mahakala.
Terrifying, yes.
Terrifying us, but managed to get to the observatory.
That's boldness in action. I mean, you can't get more bold than all of that. Just, I love again, the instruction. Well, maybe I know how to swim. I think that's so,
Yes.
a lot to unpack in that reaction to something that can be so frightening and imposing. So, I'd love to, hear from both of you, where, and maybe let's start with Vicki. Both of you have talked about Lama Yeshe kind of coming through, just continually to come through in your work and in your lives. Where do you personally feel Lama Yeshe's legacy and impact most in yourself? And then I'd love to hear your perspective on Tibetan Buddhism. So first, where do you feel it, that legacy and impact in yourself the most?
Oh, wow. That's very deep. I think that Lama, along with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has given me a living example of what is really precious and what is possible in the human body. And something really rather magnificent that that is possible. What was the other bit? And for Tibetan Buddhism, yes. So I mean, and also he's a bit like Lama Yeshe to me is a bit of a combination of like a kind of holy being, a father, and a husband. Sort of a male figure. I shouldn't say that since I've said he's so male and female, but nevertheless, he's taken the form of a kind of male. So he's been a kind of. I remember once when I was given the task of driving him around London when he came here for a course, and so we were locked together in the car. I didn't know him very well. I wasn't one of those people like you. I didn't spend much actual time with him. But when I did, it was very special. Anyway, I was driving him around, and he said, "Dear," he said, "Are you married?" I said, "No, no, Lama, I'm not married, and I've never wanted to get married." And he said, and what about children? I said, "No, I've never really wanted to have children either." And then he said, "Very good idea, very good idea." He said, he said, "Be like Christian nuns." He said, "They take Jesus Christ as their husband." They said, they take, he said, they become brides of Christ. He was very into Christian reality. And he said, that's a much better idea. Much better have someone like Jesus as a husband than an ordinary man. So he kind of boosted me up because it was kind of, it was really rather wonderful for him to sort of say that to me. So he's part of all that kind of good, positive male energy for me. And the other thing is what he's done within terms of Tibetan Buddhism is, I think, and His Holiness, that I interviewed the Dalai Lama a few times too, and I said to him, and Lama demonstrated it. I asked the Dalai Lama, how is it possible to bring Tibetan Buddhism to the West when it was so full of cultural differences? And he said, you take the essence, dear. His Holiness said, you take the essence, take the essence. And I think that's still what is most important to me. And I think in Tibetan Buddhism, I think the cultural aspect is for a very, very few people. They can't identify with it. It's not in our culture or in our kind of cultural memory. But the essence of what Tibetan Buddhism has got is so incredible. It's like a kind of gem. It's like a gold, real piece of precious gold. So I think that is for me still the important thing is not to forget, especially the Mahayana aspect, not the tradition aspect, but the Mahayana aspect is, I think, extraordinary. And emptiness, of course. Yeah.
Thank you, Vicki. Judy, same question to you.
For
Where do you
me, for
feel
me,
the impact?
my relationship with Lama, it has, I still think informs almost everything I do. Um, Remember that question, what would Jesus do? It's kind of what would Lama do? And Lama always talked about thinking big, it was always make it bigger, make it stronger, make it more. I think there are some other students that manifest that very nicely. So I still reflect on that, and I'm hopeful. I think so much of him comes across in the writing that you can access and in video. I don't want people to feel left out that they didn't have that personal relationship with him, that they can have that still, that that's available to them if they read. And I've met many people who have become students of Lama long after Lama died from reading a book. At Tse Chen Ling, even, people, said, this is why I'm here, a book of Lama's
Yes.
teaching. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping that you all feel, the ones of you who have not met him, that you have access to him. And I don't feel I've ever had a problem with making a decision when I think of what is best for the greater good, what's the most compassionate, what's the most skillful way that I can do this. So much of my practice has been action in the world, as you've heard from me today, but also the essence of, as Vicki said, Tibetan Buddhism um, is so precious. And you can tell from seeing me, I'm 83 years old. I'm going through some of the suffering of old age, as many of us are. And and we say to each other all the time, if we didn't have Buddhism, this would be so hard. It's really made it possible, to withstand some of the suffering that at least we were not we were told. No one fooled around with us and said, oh no, it's just going to be blissful golden, we're there. So I'm hoping that this will see me through the rest of this life and through my death process. And I've moved to a community that is run by Buddhists and Quakers, to be here, hoping that my death process will be supported in the kind of way that I want. Um, so thank you, Lama.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, we have time, and I'd love to see if anybody has any questions for either Vicki or Judy, any discussion points or co-reflections. Really encourage you to raise your virtual hand. So if anybody has any, please join in. So please, we have time for that. In the meantime, what I'll do is I'll ask a question. And it's rather personal, I guess. I'm speaking from my own perspective. I've been around FPMT organizations for 20 plus years, and again, I'm can see the impact of women firsthand. See most of the students, the staff, the volunteers, and new ordained sangha as being women. And I know that there could be a variety of factors in that at play, but I'd like to know if you feel if this traces back to those early days and the culture that was formed then, or the freedom, the boldness that was formed then? Do you feel that that's really shaped the community that people like me and people younger than myself who have received and will receive? So that's for both of you. So feel free to jump in.
Well, I think Lama started the ball rolling, and there's a wonderful piece written by Dr. Nick about the formation of FPMT and Lama's vision. And we reflect back on Lama's vision, you know, in these organizations. He started it. And I think it would be well for all people involved to read what Dr. Nick had to say about Lama's vision about the formation of FPMT and the other organizations, the, you know, for the Sangha, etc. Keep it in mind, you know, it's a vast vision, and we need to continue to work on it.
Yeah, I think that if Lama hadn't been so encouraging of women, if it had been different, if it had been different, then it wouldn't be what it is today. There is, as you said, Stephen, there are so many wonderful female teachers now that we have. But if that had been squashed or at the beginning, which it wasn't at all, it was encouraged. I think that I think we have, I think that we've got a lovely female director at Jamyang in London, and that's and we all know that we all know the good female teachers who are traveling, Rabina and so forth, and yeah, so it set a precedent, maybe that yes. And don't forget that the kind of women who did sort of go off to Copan in those early days, they were, they weren't the normal types really. They were, I mean, I loved it when I went to Copan, and it was in 76, and what wonderful bunch of people. It was like that was half the glee of joy of going to these going to these teachings in the early. I met such fabulous people who I wouldn't have met across the board from all countries. People who were drawn to make that journey. They were great, complete mishmash of mishmash of people, and they were bold and intrepid and thinking outside the box and
Traveling overland to India, many of them. I've done oral histories on a number of them, and
yeah.
amazing stories each of them had.
Yeah.
It's really a fabulous story. I think another thing that comes through both of you um, is a sense of curiosity and joy. And I'm assuming that those were also very operative characteristics that were brought forth or nurtured by your time with Lama Yeshe and subsequent living with him coming through again and again. Could you speak about those unique qualities and how they may have impacted you? And I ask at a time when I
Lama
think
Yeshe
we all
utterly
need that.
hilarious. He was so funny. And Vicki talked about his communication, but he would mime things that he could have been a stand-up comedian, really. What the way he would mime things, he could imitate anyone. And one time he was explaining to me when he met Zena in the mornings, he said she would be so ugly. And then later on, she would be beautiful. And he didn't understand what happened. And he said one day he was looking in the window and he saw her at the mirror, and he he starts miming a woman putting on makeup and lipstick and stuff, and he does the whole routine of the eyebrows and everything in front of me, and just laughing. I mean, we would just, I mean, he would literally fall on the floor sometimes laughing. And that joyousness was so attractive to me. This did not have to be somber and hard, it could be, and he was curious. He was always curious about what he came to Berkeley one summer to study Western philosophy and had tutors in Western philosophy. And he, whatever the topic was, he was interested.
Mm. Yes, I think the whole point about a spiritual path, if you're interested, is to be curious.
Mm-hmm.
I think curiosity is really, really important. And I loved it. I always asked. I was always curious. I was always asking questions more than most. Drove people mad usually. They got so irritated with me, but wanting to know, wanting to really know. And that was, and yes, wanting to know, especially in the religion, in the church. I was brought up as a Christian. I would ask all these questions and nobody could answer them or would answer them. It was very frustrating for me. And so the fact that they welcomed it, they loved the questions because they'd been taught through debate and questioning themselves. So I think I think that's terribly important. I think it keeps you alert too. And you'd never, ever, ever win an argument with a Tibetan because they knew every which way to counteract it. So it kept you on your toes. Mm. And the joy, I mean, they do have this, there's something about the Dharma when it's practiced properly and sincerely. It does generate a lot of joy. And I think that's what people are after, really. Yeah.
Beautiful. We did have a question come in chat, and we still have time, so I encourage you all to ask any questions or share any reflections with Judy and Vicki. I have a question that came in through chat for Vicki. The person asks, and the person is a photojournalist, so they're asking from a very similar sort of profession as yours. They've read Cave in the Snow many times and wonder if there's one story that you would have liked to seen included that was not, for whatever reasons that may have been. Is there something that was left on the cutting room floor, and acknowledge that those things happened that you would like to, that you could share?
No, but what I discovered after the book was published were other stories that she didn't tell me. It was very, very hard actually getting information out of her because, as a nun, you're not meant to, quite rightly, you're not meant to talk about, your yourself or let alone your realizations. But she did let things drop. One was that she had another very serious accident when she was in the cave. I think she almost cut her thumb off when she was trying to cut wood. There was something like that, really serious. And I thought, why on earth didn't she tell me that? I prodded her and prodded her and prodded her to get the information I did manage to get out of her. So that was one thing. And the other thing was, yes, she had some other amazing experiences too. And I can't remember what they were. Anyway, there were other things that I didn't manage to get. But I think what I did manage to get, I think, went in. Yes, I don't think I left anything out. Um, hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vicki. Judy, I want to come back to something you brought up that's left a very vivid image in my mind that's lovely, and that's you and Lama Yeshe going through Vogue magazine. So I'd love to hear any reflections on that.
You know,
Again, the
it
cultural translation process.
it really pointed out our culture to me. I was learning about, from him by his incredulousness. So he's asking me, why are these people wearing these odd outfits, Is that what they wear in America? And I said, no, no, they don't wear those clothes like that. Why why do they have a magazine with pictures of people wearing clothes when nobody really wears those clothes, So he would sort of dig into and it would bring I hadn't really thought about that before, Um, um, we didn't have much teaching material in Nepal, and it was because Max was a real high fashion woman that there was a Vogue magazine even available. The other thing we brought to him was the Beatles. We brought the first Beatles album to Kathmandu, and Max happened to have a record player. And so we brought this Beatles album all around. Anyone who had a record player wanted us at their party because we had the Beatles album. But him sort of getting these tastes of American culture while he was still in Kathmandu and then coming to the West and getting it full on, full on. He liked to go antique shopping. We'd like to go into antique stores together. And up and down Solano Avenue in Berkeley, there were a number at the time, and we would kind of browse up and down the street. And uh, was interesting too that after he left, I went into one of them maybe a year or two later, and they said, you're the woman that you used to bring that man in here, and I mean, he made such an impression just by walking into a store that they identified me, as being with him and asked about him. So that we'd go to the co-op and he'd be talking to everybody at the co-op was the grocery store, talking to everybody about recipes and what he was going to cook for dinner. And I'd, kind of lose track of him. And he was comparing cooking methods with someone in an aisle somewhere. But, you could see people just stunned, by their interaction with him. And you knew that it was unforgettable.
Dude, beautiful, beautiful. Vicky, anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I think if Judy and I got together, we could talk Lama Yeshe stories. Well, indeed, anybody who Lama Yeshe stories, forever, because he was exceptional, really exceptional person. Yes, I'm very, very, very giving. His whole thing was to give. All that business of talking to people in aisles or wherever, it was just all giving. It
Yeah.
was it was such a demonstration of the teachings, you know, the teachings. It was just bodhicitta, it was just love and kindness the whole time. A demonstration of it, really. Um, Even when he was very, very sick, he was just interested in giving, this giving, yeah.
Yeah, I made several recordings about the stories around his death,
Oh, wonderful.
um, including the doctor that took care of him. So some of you, he had a heart condition from the get-go. We knew that very early. In fact, first time he came to the West, he was examined and given less than 18 months to live. So he lived a long time after that. And he told me that his heart had stopped many times and that through meditation, he would start it back up again.
Yeah.
And so by time he passed away, um, his heart had enlarged so much it filled up way a lot of his chest cavity. But the doctor that was dealing with him said that he had grown an extra vein around, uh, going past one of the impasses in his heart. that he had never seen anything like that before. And then we brought his body to Vajrapani and cremated him there. And lamas came in from all around the world. Lama Song Rinpoche came to officiate at the funeral or at the cremation. But it was like talking about teaching, even through the death process and the cremation. It was death, now he's demonstrating impermanence, and in such a, deep way that I don't know if you've seen this picture, but there's an incredible picture at the cremation stupa, which was on fire, and someone took a camera and just took a picture inside of the fire in the stupa, and it's his skull in flames.
Mm.
And to me, okay, so their impermanence, death and impermanence manifest, but also in the sky out of nowhere appeared a rainbow that day. And, you know, I think you wrote the book then about what happened next, Vicki, the incarnation.
The picture is in the book.
Ah, of the flaming skull.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Thank you both so much. We're here at the end of our time together, and as Vicki and Judy both, I think, have alluded to, and we've all witnessed, this could go on in the most glorious way as Lama Yeshe continues to come through, both for these two remarkable women who've contributed to Lama's legacy, but also through the collective of organizations and Dharma centers and communities around. So this has just been fabulous to have this brief time to connect with that coming through. So thank you, Judy. Thank you, Vicki, so much for your time and for being here and sharing your stories with all of us.
You're so welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It's always a great pleasure and a great honor to talk about Lama Yeshe. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. As we come here to the end, we want to also share, we have additional programs in this remarkable series. Before we get to those, we made mention of two books, and we made mention of a lot of material, but we definitely encourage you to seek out the book Big Love, which is a monument to love, and just a fabulous collection compendium of the wisdom tradition that Lama Yeshe left for all of us. And then please do look at the books of Vicki Mackenzie. We've put one here on screen, The Revolutionary Life of Frida Betty. So please do seek those out. In addition, we also are doing something as part of the Women of Wisdom, celebrating the living legacy of Buddhist women, we've partnered with the Treasury of Lives. The Treasury of Lives is a database dedicated to cataloging, sharing, and illuminating for the world the great lineage of Tibetan and Himalayan masters. And what they recognized as they prepared these bios to share with the world is there was a vacuity of bios focusing on women. So what we're doing very briefly is reminding people that the Treasury of Lives has this brilliant women's initiative. They've just, over the course of our partnership, have completed 100 bios of women in the Himalayan and Tibetan Buddhist traditions. So at the end of each program in our series, we're sharing briefly one of those bios. This is Jetsuma Kunga Trinle Wangmo. She was one of the profound lineage holders of the Jonang tradition and formed a very deep connection with Jonang Taranata, one of the great scholar adepts in Tibetan Buddhist history. She formed that connection at an early age. She was in his inner circle, eventually becoming his consort, his scribe, and one of his closest disciples and lineage holders. She was definitely a formidable and intellectual and a catalyst for the eventual transmission of the Jonang lineage from central to south central Tibet to eastern Tibet. She also formed a connection with the fifth Dalai Lama at the end of her life, receiving teachings and empowerment. So I'll drop in our chat here a link to the Treasury, and you can explore more of their work in the Women's Initiative. And with that, we will again thank Judy and Vicki for their time with us today, and thank you all for being here.
Much. Thank you.
Bye.